My name is Daniel Nichols. I'm the Clinical Chair of Mental Health Nursing with ACT Health and University of Canberra. Before we commence the official proceedings, I wish to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we are meeting on, the Ngunnawal people. I wish to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and the region. I would also like to acknowledge and welcome other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be attending today's event. First of all, I'd like to welcome and acknowledge the Vice-Chancellor, Professor Stephen Parker. Thank you for coming. The Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Professor Nick Klomp. He's Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Education. The Dean of Health, Diane Gibson, who was the principal organiser of this evening. Ms Ronnie Kroom, the ACT Chief Nurse. Ms Tina Brasher, the Executive Director of Mental Health, Justice Health and Drug and Alcohol Services. Mr Ron Carl, retired ACT Chief Magistrate. Distinguished alumni Patricia Cooper and Susan Alexander. Distinguished guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. The topic of the panel that we'll be exploring this evening is one that is important to all of us, the society's responsibility for the emotional health and well-being of the community. It will be facilitated by well-known journalist and social commentator Virginia Haussegger, who I'm just going to introduce now because I haven't mentioned her yet. She's also adjunct professor at University of Canberra. She's with the ANSOG Institute of Governance, where she's involved with a project celebrating the contribution of women to the public health sector excellence. She's also on the board of United Nations Women and involved with a number of NGOs internationally, for example, being concerned with issues around the very real needs of women, widows and orphans in Afghanistan. Virginia will introduce our panellists shortly, so can you join me please in welcoming Virginia.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I'm hoping that you can hear me all clearly. Is that clear enough down the back? Yes, nodding? Thank you very much for that warm welcome, and first of all, thank you to all of you for coming along tonight. I've got to say I'm rather stoked to see so many people come out to an event like this on a Monday night, on a beautiful evening, to come along and to discuss the hard stuff, although as it was just put to me by Helen, it's really the Cinderella subject, emotional well-being and our mental health, the subjects that don't get nearly enough discussion publicly or certainly in our mainstream media, which is something we might talk about a little bit later. But it's wonderful to see you all here, and it's a great cross-section of people from all sectors, so it's fantastic to have you here tonight. Thank you. And I hope that you enjoy this discussion, and our aim is at the end of the evening that you leave feeling challenged, provoked, and certainly go home with plenty of food for thought, but most importantly, that what we do here tonight starts a wider discussion. And I want to congratulate the faculty for putting on this event. I'm saying this now because I know I'll forget at the end. I always forget at the end to say the thank you. So I'm going to say this now. Yes, I'm involved with the University of Canberra and I'm very proud to be so. But I'm particularly impressed by the faculty in holding an event like this and bravely saying, no, we will do this. It's a tough subject, but we'll do it. And we'll bring together a top-class panel to discuss this difficult subject. And we certainly have got a top-shelf panel tonight, and I'm thrilled to be up here on stage with them. And in fact, I can't wait to get going because I'm fascinated to hear what they've all got to say. Our first panellist, now in this order, I've just swapped this around a little bit, Professor Lisa Jackson-Pulver. Lisa is actually going to have to leave us early tonight. She has to fly out, and we're so grateful that you could be here for the time that you can. So at one stage she will disappear, but please don't be alarmed. Lisa holds the inaugural chair of Indigenous Health and is a Professor of Public Health at UNSW. She's also Director of Maru Mari Indigenous Health Unit, and I was very surprised to learn she's also a wing commander in the RAF Special Reserve, or Specialist Reserve. Lisa is also a fellow adjunct professor here at UC, and in 2011 was made a member of the Order of Australia. Sitting next to Lisa is Francis Sullivan. Francis is the Secretary-General of the Australian Medical Association. He represents the interests of over 27,000 doctors from across Australia, doctors spanning all fields and all specialties. Before joining the AMA, Francis spent 14 years as the CEO of Catholic Health Australia, and in that role he was spokesperson for over 70 private and public hospitals and more than 400 aged care facilities nationwide. Next to Francis is David Lovegrove. David has been a mental health consumer representative for over 9 years. He's the Vice President of the ACT Mental Health Coalition and a board member of the newly formed national body Community Mental Health Australia. David's an advocate with the ACT Mental Health Consumer Network, and he sits on various other committees, too many to name, like many on this panel. Joe Roth, to my right, is a former Wallabies and Brumbies player, and I have to admit I know nothing about football, rugby, soccer or netball, and had to ask him what exactly that meant. Does he play football or soccer or whatever it is? I shouldn't admit that, being a news presenter, because I do talk about Wallabies and Brumbies, but you know, it could be cricket as far as I'm concerned. Sorry.
Not offended at all.
I've just completely given myself away. My boss told me not to do that, but it's true. It's a bit of a gender issue with me, but we'll come to that some other time. Sorry, Joe. Joe is currently CEO. He's been was with the Wallabies and a Brumby player on the world stage for many years, and retired at the age of 29. I have to say I giggled when I read that, because it seems like such an odd age to be retiring at 29, but that presents all sorts of interesting challenges, which we'll come to. Joe is currently CEO of the UC Union, and he previously held the role of Director of Workforce Development at Lifeline Australia. Professor Helen Berry is a research fellow in psychiatric epidemiology and Deputy Director of the Centre for Research and Action in Public Health here at the University of Canberra. Her research involves developing, merging and analysing panel and climate data to better understand the interrelationships between climate change, complex disadvantage, community connectedness and mental health. So looking at our panel tonight, I think we can pretty much say we've really got it all covered. The research, the academia, the consumer, the public presentation, the service providers, we've got it all covered. So I think we're in for a fascinating discussion. What I've asked our panellists to do to kick off the discussion tonight is to each give us a couple of minutes, 2 or 3 minutes, opening remarks addressing our key theme, which, as you know, is our emotional and mental well-being. What is society's responsibility? And as I said at the opening, it's a tough question. It's a tough question for a range of reasons. It's also a very broad question. And I must admit, when I was first approached by the university to be involved in this forum, I found myself really dwelling on the issue of society's responsibility and battling with that question of an individual's responsibility versus society's responsibility, government's responsibility, an institution's responsibility, and how much is my responsibility. But I also found myself dwelling on something that that hopefully will get mentioned tonight too, is media's responsibility. I work in the mainstream media and have for 25 years, and The issue of our emotional well-being and mental health as a community, as a society, is something that troubles me deeply and has for an awful long time. So I think we're in for a rollicking discussion. So I'm going to start at this end. Helen, to go first, to give us some opening remarks addressing our issue of emotional and mental well-being. What is society's responsibility? After the opening remarks, we'll then be open for Q&A with the panel and questions from the audience. So we'll start with you, Helen.
Good evening, and thank you, Virginia. What I'd like to start by saying is that I think that mental health and emotional well-being has a lot to do with the way we think about who we are and what it means to be part of society. We live in an increasingly individualistic society. We tend to think me and I rather than us and we. We have iPads and iPhones and I select and I everything else. And community and society, these things come second. So I think we think about mental health in the same way. Individuals get sick and they get mental health problems. And so what do we do as a society? We invest money in developing medications that individuals can take to fix their individual treatment problems with treatments that are delivered by individual GPs in individual medical settings. We think about this very much as the individual. But mental health is everybody's business because we're social animals first and foremost. Being isolated and being lonely are terrible. They're the worst things that we can have. If we want to punish somebody really, really badly, we put them in solitary confinement. It's not natural to be away from our social group. If our group or our family or our community or our society isn't working properly, if it's sick, if it's unjust or unequal, then we're sick. We can't be well as individuals unless our group is well also. It's no coincidence that the most marginalised of Australians suffer the highest rates of mental and related disorders. This shouldn't surprise us. The fact that single mums have mental health disorders at 3 to 4 times at least the rate of anybody else shouldn't surprise us. And I know Lisa's going to talk about some of this as well. So sure, individuals do get disorders, and sometimes that's just plain bad luck. And sometimes people get so sick that they really do need individual treatments and help. And I would argue strongly that we need much more of that. But most mental disorders are primarily socially caused, and we need social solutions.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Helen. And Helen's already raised a number of issues that I'm sure we'll talk further about and raises a number of questions. And David, your opening remarks on our emotional and mental well-being. What is society's responsibility?
Thanks, Virginia, and thanks, everybody. Well, as I'm sure everyone would have some identification with these concepts of mental health and emotional well-being, or emotional health and mental well-being, they're very personal in one level and very individual as everyone here. But I think, for me, it covers a whole lot of factors, though, as individual and personal as that is, that everyone, I think, would have in common. And I think that's what unites us, that we're all have mental distress, perhaps at different parts of our lives and in different circumstances. And I think knowing how to respond to these and how to still, despite the impact that they have on our lives, able to find the supports and meaning in our life and in the community, I think is critical to maintaining and developing that ongoing and mental health and well-being, and having a valued and contributing role in the society. I guess when I was being the consumer representative here, I was diagnosed with major depression during the time that I was trying to complete or study for a PhD, and it along with other complications around fatigue following glandular fever just made it impossible for me to complete that. So I think it's been a real journey for me 9 years ago when I wasn't able to continue working full-time in the normal sense. I came across a group of people that were also had a whole range of different diagnoses or experiences of mental distress. And I think what struck me was, though everyone was unique and individual, they had similar problems. And basically, they were how people did or didn't receive help in the mental health system or in the wider community. And regardless of whatever their symptoms may have been, there was so much in common. I thought, oh, this is so important that the systems that are out there that are supposed to be there to help people with mental illness are often a big factor in exacerbating or preventing recovery in lots of ways through stigmatisation and discrimination and a whole lot of other factors that people experience. And so for me, the social factors are really important. Getting a mental health system that is more holistic, less fragmented, but primarily giving people other ways of being valued and having contributed roles in the community. And for me, being an advocate for those with lived experience of mental distress, it was critical to that for me, but only one part. Another part was also, that wasn't in my bio as read out, was being a teacher of stretching and flexibility training. So we're embodied beings, we're not just minds or emotions, we live in a body, and I think that was critical in terms of my recovery as well. So I'm getting the wrap-up sign. Thank you.
Thank you for that, David, and I must apologise for not mentioning your stretching. I must admit, I looked at that and I thought, I don't really understand what that means, so I deleted it. Just before we go on, what is the stretching that you talk about as you've been a teacher of stretching? Sounds a bit medieval to me.
Well, it might if you're an onlooker, but it's a system actually developed here in Canberra. It's one of the perhaps cutting-edge, leading-edge systems of stretching and flexibility training in the world, and it's developed by a team.
But do you mean physically, or
physically? Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it complements the mental flexibility as well, but it makes you aware of your own body and the asymmetries that we all carry, how we hold stress in our muscles, and how trauma is also replicated and held in our physical structure as well, in our posture.
Basically a form of yoga of sorts.
Well, it draws on a lot of those systems as well, but it's very much a system that's been developed here in Canberra over the last 25 years, so it's a westernised system that teaches people techniques and skills to use in their everyday life rather than just standing in front of a yoga class. Not that that's a bad thing, but actually trying to give people the tools themselves and the techniques to be able to apply in their work and life situation.
Specifically for countering stress and anxiety.
Countering stress, correcting imbalances in the body, just giving people a whole awareness of that mind-body connection and how that impacts on our health, and being able to have control of your body more and its patterns of flexibility and holding stress, even if we can't always do that for our mental health conditions.
Fantastic.
As well.
I'm going to have to get you to give us a few demos later on. Francis.
Thank you, and thanks for the invitation. I think the answer to the question about what is the responsibility of government, for me, is simple. It is their main responsibility. Giving people access to essential health care and social support and a job, it's not an individual responsibility. It's something we as a community, by right, should be providing each other. And I think if we're not careful, we're slipping into an unconscious acceptance by governments of a mindset, what I would call driven by markets. It's acting as if individuals are people that do things, supply things, achieve things, and comply with things, and that we all need to fit into neat little boxes. But individuals are persons, they're more creative than that. And I've never heard a politician in the last 20 years in a leadership role talk about how we can live a good life, a happy life, a fulfilling life. All I ever hear is how we can fit in to make things more efficient, more productive, how we can meet our KPIs, how we can make sure that we can exist in a job that's not secure, how we can make sure we do more with less. And this stress this environment that we're living in creates a dis-ease. And the more dis-ease that we have, it plays out in really destructive ways. So I think governments not only need to take responsibility, they need to start enabling communities to take charge of things for themselves and begin to enable people to maybe work less, enjoy life more, connect with each other again, because we reward disengagement, we reward individualism, and for somehow, somewhere along the line, we forgot that difference was good and that to achieve something that's not mainstream wasn't the gig, when really the gig was to become ourselves. That's why I like that word being rather than doing in this debate.
Thank you, Francis. Very strong and powerful words, and how very true that word more. We seem to focus so much on growing more, saving more, when the emphasis, particularly on government, is all about growth rather than well-being. Yeah, very true indeed. Lisa.
Thank you. The first thing I need to do is to pay my respects to the traditional owners of this gorgeous country and thank them sincerely for allowing me to speak here tonight. I'm a Wiradjuri Koori woman. My people don't come from far from here, and I'd like to pay my respects to the other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here with us today. Look, I want to sort of go back to a story that happened here about 60,000 years ago, right? You know that Aboriginal people have been here for a very long time, and we've got a particular take on what health is about. And health is not just the absence of physical disease or infirmity. It's not only about the individual, but it's about your social, your emotional, your physical well-being in context of who you are, your family, where you live, and how you go about doing yourself. And when I talk about this with people, often a lot of non-Aboriginal people say, hey, it's the same for me. The other thing I wanted to just pop in here at these initial thoughts was that we often go off and link the words emotional and mental well-being together as though they are somehow linked. But I want to urge you to understand these are vastly different things. And we often have got expressions nowadays that sort of slide into each other. You know, the LOLs and, you know, social emotional well-being or mental health and well-being are not the same things. They're very different things. Mental illness is often what we're trying to describe when we talk about mental health, right? When we talk about well-being, people always put it into that soft side of what mental health is about. But actually, well-being is, as you've correctly said, is more about the whole person, and it's about the holism, and it's about how people feel empowered and how they feel as though they belong. And I think one of the most important things that have happened in our society of recent times is back in 2008 when Kevin Rudd apologised to Aboriginal people, okay, and did the formal apology. I know most of you will remember where you were on Apology Day. Many of you were lucky enough to be here when that happened. And I'm sure there would have been a strike of lightning and love going through this beautiful place called Canberra, because I certainly felt it in Sydney. But the important thing is that that moment in time, we got permission through the elders who came here and welcomed to country the parliament of this land for the first time in 222 years. The welcome to country allowed everyone to belong. And I personally believe that was the very first and most important step in Australia's history around our whole emotional well-being, our physical well-being as a nation, as people together. I think it's important we take note of that. The second or the third thing I just wanted to quickly say in these introductory remarks is that I was recently at the OECD meeting in India. It finished a week ago. And one of the things that the World Forum was all about was this whole thing around well-being. And what the OECD has always been connected to is this whole idea of GDP. Right, your country's doing well when your GDP is up and blah-de-blah-de-blah. The thing is that everyone absolutely agreed that the measure of success of a nation can no longer be economic. It can no longer be how many widgets you sell overseas or how many widgets you import. It's really about how your country is, how people feel secure in their homes, whether or not they've got meaningful jobs, whether or not they're able to have babies in a safe environment, whether or not they're able to get vaccines and medical care when they need it, whether or not they can sleep safely in their houses at night, whether or not they've got food sovereignty, water sovereignty, and whether or not they're secure in being who they are culturally. These are measures that we here in Australia are starting to put into how it is we start enumerating our countrymen and how it is we start to measure our progress and our success. And this is something that the World Agenda is going into at the moment. So back to my first statement, just recognise that well-being and emotional health, mental well-being and emotional health can be vastly different things. They're three different words. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. That's great. And I must say it's very encouraging to hear that the recent OECD meeting did deal with this issue of wellbeing and finally was brave enough to tackle the issue of GDP and is economic growth what it's all about. Interestingly, and the point has been made about how hard we work by Francis, among OECD countries, Australia ranks as one of the highest working hours among men and women. We work ridiculously long hours compared to some of our OECD partners. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to throw it open to questions. Do we still have a microphone floating the floor? We do, okay. And for some of our panellists, if you want to jump in, you might find that holding your mic up to your lips like this could work, if need be. We've heard various takes already on what is emotional health, mental well-being. And there's a question here that I'm hoping will just help us zoom in to clarify some definitions. Now, Paul Bateson, I believe, is with us. Paul, are you around? Yep, pop up. We'll give you a microphone and you can kick us off with your question.
Thank you, Virginia. And this leads on from some of those excellent final comments. I think we have to get back to basics. And the question is, what constitutes good emotional and mental health, and from this, who is responsible, our society or the individual?
Thanks, Paul. Right, the nub of it. Now, we've sort of danced around this a little bit, but I think it's a question that perhaps I'll throw open to the panel. Who would like to take this first? Definitions. What constitutes good emotional mental health? And who is responsible?
I reckon it depends on who you are, where you are, who you belong to, and what's important to you. Because what is, safe and secure for one group of people may not be so for others. So all of our definitions have to be culturally bound, and we haven't had the discussion in Australia yet of what a lot of this stuff means. You know, a lot of the definitions have come out of some vague process that has not been as inclusive as it could be. For example, in my family, the definition of wealth, right? So if I were to ask you, all you fellas, what's the definition of wealth? I guarantee we'll end up with how many of us there are, plus a few more definitions of wealth. For me, it's when the mob knocks on the door and I can open up the fridge and feed them. Okay, that for me is a definition of wealth. Okay, so when we start looking at definitions, I think we need to be abundantly clear that it's got to be broad so it is inclusive of all members of society. We have gazillions of people living in this gorgeous country who all belong, who've got something precious to contribute, but often what's coming out in our policy environment is not inclusive of the needs of us all, and we need to be very clear about that. The second thing is, who is responsible? I don't think we can keep saying it's up to government. I don't think that's fair. We are the people, right? And government members are part of the people. You know, we're the ones that have to be responsible because we're the ones that have to care for each other. We're the ones that belong to families. We're the ones that belong to community, and we're the ones that belong to each other. We belong to the academy. We belong in the government. We belong in the reference groups that we're on. We have got a voice. And so it's really up to us to guide our leadership, our national leadership, in what we want and how we want it. And I think our voice has been silenced of late.
When you say we have a voice, not everyone does. Not everyone has access or capacity to have their voice heard. So when you say it's not up to government, what about those that are disenfranchised?
Yeah, that's right. But there are a lot of groups out there that are speaking up that you can find voices for. I mean, we have got consumer representatives on this panel. We've got voices in groups for Aboriginal people, for example, through our land councils and through our Aboriginal health services. There are capacities to get those voices, but really it is up to us to empower those who we feel don't have the voice to take their hand and come along and support that, not speak for them, but to support that process.
Lisa, I just want to pick you up on one other thing, and I'm not picking on you, but because you're going early, I'm getting as much as we can from you. But you said earlier in your opening remarks, emotional wellbeing is a very different thing. It's a very different thing, and you know, we too often confuse the issue of mental health and emotional wellbeing. I'm confused. Can you explain why they're very different things?
Often when we look at mental health, we've got a whole series of systems and hospitals and, you know, treatment protocols and pharmacological interventions and other interventions to be able to deal with mental health issues, right? And we always call it mental health, we don't call it mental disease, which is actually what it is. When we talk about people's well-being in the context of work that I come from, I say to a grandmother, you know, what's well-being for you? And this was said in some research recently, well, it's being able to see my kids dance ceremony, and it's being able to hear the young ones learning a bit of language. Now, this old lady, she's as poor as a church mouse, right? She doesn't have much, but she's rich because she's seeing these grannies doing these extraordinary cultural things, and she's seeing the kids starting to speak Bundjalung at home, right? That's well-being, and that's empowerment. And that doesn't have anything to do logically with mental disease, but the absence of that kind of well-being can have diabolical effects on someone's mental well-being and can cause, I think, and contribute significantly to people becoming unwell and sick and suffering dis-ease.
The reason I say I'm confused is because mental health, of course, we're not necessarily just talking about a severe mental health issue, but also the issues of depression, anxiety, that sort of thing. I would have thought that if you have strong emotional well-being, i.e. you feel safe, loved, valued, one's mental health, and I'm not talking about the extreme level, but one's mental health would be generally supported by your good emotional well-being. That's why I would have thought the two go together like hand in glove. Does anyone else want to add to that on the panel? Helen?
I think what Lisa's saying is absolutely right, based on my own research and my own experience of being a human being. And what you're saying is right too, Virginia. The two are very closely related. We can't, if we think about what good mental health is, it's really about being able to participate in life in a way that's appropriate to who you are and where you are, in terms of physically where you live, who you belong to, what stage you're at in your life, what's expected of you and what you can reasonably expect of your life at that moment. And in my own research, what I've found is that the people who are the happiest and the people who recover fastest from mental disorders, and they are two different things, are those who are able to achieve a good balance of give and get. So having good mental health is not about getting a whole lot of stuff for yourself, so having a lot of friends, having a lot of social support, having a great job, having enough money, all that. It is about those things, but it is at least as much about what you contribute. And people who have a lot of stuff and a lot of good stuff in their lives, but who feel that they're not contributing, they are the ones who are unhappy. They're the ones who are at high risk of mental disorders. We really need to get past the idea that we're individuals and that what we have is what counts and what we can accumulate is what counts. Unless we think about accumulation in terms of who we really are, what life's about, what really matters to us as human beings, and what we can do to make the lives of others happier and better.
Thanks, Helen. David, your thoughts on that?
Yes, I don't know whether people... Oh,
that's it, yep.
Look, I think there's a couple of issues mixed in together here, and that tend to get mixed fairly easily. One is when people talk about mental health, they often mean mental illness, and they're two different dimensions, two sides of the one coin, as it were. But we do perhaps have to need to focus more on what makes us healthy, what makes us mentally healthy and healthy in community, in society, and not just on an illness model, a deficit model. And I think that's where also this recovery movement in mental health is really important, because it gives people hope with the right psychosocial supports and the right basic minimum sort of levels of financial security, accommodation supports, employment and education opportunities. All these go to make all of us mentally healthy, and that also then impacts on us being able to maintain that emotional well-being, which is more of that individual balancing act, I guess, in terms of how we respond internally to the things that impact on us, whether they're illness or whether they're from the society that impacts us in terms of how it reacts to us because of our particular condition that we're balancing with. But I think it's a false dilemma to put it in terms of individual versus society. I think we are relational beings, and yet at the same time there are individual responsibilities that we can all learn in terms of the way we think, the way we become aware of our emotions and how they negatively or positively impact on our mental health and well-being. And I think those are important to emphasise as well. I don't think it's an either or, it's both and I think society, though, providing everyone, especially if you come from a human rights and a social justice standpoint, which I do, that if everyone has a modicum, a minimum of those basic, what is often called the social determinants of health, I think these are the things that really give us the foundation to then take more control and agency over our health and well-being in terms of managing our emotions and also having a contributing role in the community that is supported. That's based on our strengths, not on our weaknesses or on our illness, but on how we can then be supported to contribute in ways that are enriching to everyone, not a burden to society, as often is constructed in the current framework.
That issue of our own agency is something I want to come back to because it's very important. But before we do, let's just talk a little bit about social norms. I want to throw a question, or take a question from the floor from Jimmy Kwong. Are you with us, Jimmy? He is. And I should just explain to everyone, we did ask for questions to be submitted, and we've had some marvellous, marvellous questions submitted. Some of you have asked that your questions be read out anonymously, didn't want to put a name to them, which is absolutely fine. And some I will get to, and some I won't get to. I apologise because there are so many of them. But Jimmy.
Thanks, Virginia. First of all, thank you for the panel coming to address this issue to us. My name is Jimmy Kwong. I like many Canberrans, I was a public servant for 26 years, and now I'm full-time pastor in an Asian Christian church. My question is about that society's norms, as just Virginia just mentioned, that why is it failing to fit in with the society's norms would be so critical to a group or individuals in terms of their emotional and mental health?
Fitting in. Why is fitting in so important to one's emotional and mental health? Joe, I think that might be one for you to kick off.
Sure.
Use a sporting analogy.
And it's very interesting when we talk about that libertarian model where everyone is expected to succeed and to succeed to the very highest level in their life. In professional sport, it's probably even more pointed. And that expectation sits as a burden on a lot of people, and it, to be honest, it detracts from any sense of team or sense of community that can be promoted or that can exist. That's why, and I refer back to the friend that I had, and his inability to establish emotional well-being, because he was expected to be a warrior. He was expected to be impenetrable, invincible, all of those things. Society, us in the room, expected him to be like that. And so he struggled enormously when he wasn't able to be that person anymore. So I think, yes, there are societal expectations that sit and decay our culture. If I can just draw another example, I was just thinking on only a moment ago, was the great downfall of Lance Armstrong. There's a man who established a community. He provided and inspired emotional well-being in so many cancer sufferers, in so many people around the world who struggled emotionally and mentally, and yet there was an individual who drove a whole community, and that's just gone up in a puff of smoke. Now, that should have, in essence, that should have been society driving that community, not the individual. And it's a sad indictment on, I guess, the vices of this libertarian society, that we expected him to do whatever it took for him to be so successful, for him to then be allowed to give back.
Joe, I want to ask you about this, and I'm really sorry to hear about your friend's situation, and I've just been going through a similar thing, also with a male colleague. One of the things that struck me most, because it was all about identity, and if you lose, in my friend's case, a loss of a big job and big profile led to a collapse in sense of self. What has surprised me in this process, well, one, is that my friend is a male. None of his male colleagues have spoken to him about it, and everyone knows about it, but no one is talking about it. One, I really have problems with that. But the other is the issue of identity. This person's identity was so wrapped up in profile. I found myself thinking, but whose fault is that? Is that your fault, or is it the media industry's fault because he's a journalist, or is it the society's fault because we put, celebrity people up on pedestals, or does it come back to the individual? And I'm not sure. I find myself getting a little frustrated with my friend, thinking, you are more than just your job, and you are more than your celebrity profile, so come on, pull yourself together. Does that seem very harsh?
The last bit.
Tell me why.
Sorry. Look, I think the pulling yourself together bit is probably the harsher bit of it, because we are, and especially in a society that does highlight, overemphasise the individual dimensions of success and celebrity, and rather than perhaps, although in Joe's sport it's more a team effort as well, and people can still shine as individuals, but it's still a team effort. And I think there needs to be more appreciation in terms of what society values, and is reflected in the media in terms of what success or achievement means, that it's not just having to be climbed to the top of the heap by hook or by crook, and over, regardless of the integrity of the processes or your own integrity. I think that's sad if that is what the dynamic that our society tends to reward or like to see winners. I think we need to redefine completely differently in terms of what it means to be a winner, in terms of valuing and succeeding, and I think there's not enough of those opportunities. Perhaps you have to either somehow, it's a distortion of a competitive ethic, the two that pits one against the other, rather than appreciating the unique skills that so many people have across a diversity of skills if they're given the opportunity. Unfortunately, some people have more opportunities than others, and others don't get a chance to live out those opportunities for one reason or another. There's some personal responsibilities in that, of course, but if society's already weighed the dice, as it were, against in favour of certain groups and against others, then I think that's that equity principle again that tends to, and people are the cost of that in terms of their own potential and their own value in their own eyes as well as the eyes of the society.
Beautifully put, David. Joe, just want to come back to you, because you yourself have been through a major identity change, retiring from the world stage at 29 and becoming something completely different. How was that an emotional challenge for you? And how do you deal, or how did you deal with that?
Yep. So and I think in this instance we have to always remember in the back of our mind that the market drives the profile of your friend, of my friend. It's a commercial reality of the society we live in. As was mentioned before, this is not necessarily a good thing. In my own personal circumstance, I was faced with a very tough challenge at 29. I had 1 year left on a what I would call a lucrative contract playing professional rugby in Japan. They used to refer to it as going for the DFC at the end of your career, the dash for cash. But the point being that I also at the same time applied to go and study at Oxford, to go and read a degree there. I managed to get into Oxford, however my place couldn't be held over, and so I was faced with this situation. Do I set myself up by going to Oxford and studying for 2 years and burning a big hole in my pocket, or do I take the 1 more year? Do I take the 1 more year, and that'll, that might set me up, and I'll between these 4 walls, I worked it out that when I got my first job, when I came back from Oxford, if I had played for that 1 more year, I would have needed to work for 7 years to be able to pay for that 1 year if I'd stayed on for 1 more year. The point being that was my turning point, and that was where my decision point was, where I had to say, do I want to be identified as a rugby player, or will I make my own individual commitment to transition into another life, give myself another purpose, provide myself with another identity, and establish myself within the community post-rugby?
I just want to ask you one more question on identity, and then we're going to go to Ronnie Coombs and talk about the stigmatisation of mental health. But just on identity, do you think it is, or in your experience, is it a bit of a blokey thing that blokes do tend to wrap their identity very much around what they do? And I don't mean just in sport, but their job.
We're very simple people.
I know. Can only do one thing at a time, I know.
But yes, that's there is that I guess sense of a very simple sense of caveman-like sense of purpose that we like to do something. I would love to be able to do DIY around the home, but my wife will not let me. But I would love to actually have the satisfaction of completing something.
I'd let you.
So yes, yeah, I think well certainly, and I guess I have a skewed view because I've evolved in a professional sporting environment where you're very specialist, and it was specific. And the other thing about professional sport is it's very measurable. Whether you're good at it or whether you're bad at it, whether you win, whether you lose, you're told on a week-to-week basis whether you were good or whether you weren't. A lot of jobs aren't like that. Life isn't like that. And perhaps without stereotyping, women work with the ambiguity far better than men.
Fascinating. I want to get on to the stigmatisation. Ronnie Coombs, are you with us? She's put in a terrific question down the back there. And interestingly, a number of the questions that were submitted were around the fact that mental health problems tend to carry very heavy stigma, which is one of the reasons we don't talk about them, we don't share, and we treat mental health differently from other health. And Ronnie, I'll take that question from you.
Thanks very much, Virginia. When I sit down of an evening to watch my episode of Law and Order, I never hear about the rampant diabetic that goes on a shooting spree through a supermarket car park. It's always about the person who has a mental illness. Why is mental health so stigmatised when physical health problems are not, and what can we do about it?
It's a great question. Thank you, Ronnie. Why is mental health so stigmatised? Now, I'll throw that open to the panel. Who would like to take that first? Francis.
I think people are scared of mental illness. for a number of reasons. I think people with mental illness have been portrayed as being out of control and dangerous to everybody else. So I think that's the motif that then runs through our culture for a long time. And when people have been mentally ill, we've taken them away. And that action speaks volumes about our fear. In a sense, we put people in mental asylums like we would put people in jail. So we were treating people in the same way. So I think it's all based on fear. And secondly, just like talking about mental illness or talking to someone who's going through what you both have been dealing with, we don't teach ourselves how to be vulnerable and how to live with fear and anxiety. We teach people to run from it. And the question I ask myself all the time is, if I had a spare couple of hours, what would I do with it? And I'm frightened with the answer because I don't know. And it's because I'm conditioned to use time to do, not to be. And this whole motif is actually subtly running the whole show. You know, I heard Maxine McHugh this morning talk about her new book, and one of the interviewers asked her about her regard or otherwise for the Prime Minister. And she said many things, but one thing she did say was, I remember when I was in the Parliament and I heard the Prime Minister, then Deputy Prime Minister, get up and give a great political speech. And I knew I couldn't do that. I saw how she can do this and can do that and could do something else. And I knew I couldn't do that. So Maxine McHugh realised who she was by watching a lot of activity. And what I'm getting to is the same theme. We are scared of mental illness because maybe that could be me. And then secondly, no one has ever taught me how to deal with the fear of that and how to work my way through it so it isn't me.
How do you teach someone to be vulnerable and to sit with anxiety and fear?
Well, I think you firstly do it. I had to wait for that one. I personally think you just need to share with people how you are vulnerable. And sometimes that opens up for other people. We often go to people with solutions instead of going to people to be with them and listen. And sometimes just sharing your own way of doing the world or being in the world enables them the space to say it themselves.
Doesn't this, though, come back to the problem of the stigmatisation? And we tend to think of people who would share such a thing as being weak. It's not something that you're encouraged to put on your application for a job if you have suffered mental illness. In fact, if anything, I think people probably hide from it. So, you know, it's a big ask to say we need to share these things. Lisa?
Yeah, I think it's, I mean, you're hitting on some really fine points, and I'm conscious that I've got to leave in a moment. But there are lots of very well people out there living with mental illness, right? They are being cared for, they're being nurtured. A lot of these individuals are highly resilient people. And this is a conversation that I think as a society that we have to recognise. If we as a society can help support each other and hold each other's hands and nurture them and turn your ears on, which is what you were just saying, and be able to care enough just to listen quietly and not suddenly have to be the solutions-oriented person and not look at everything as being a problem but looking at everything as being what is, then I think we'll go a long, long way. Now, these things are cheap. Right? This is not something which has a cost attached to it, but the benefit to society will be incredibly great.
Ron, of course, is known to all of us as the former ACT Chief Magistrate, and on the issue of pathologising mental health, mental illness.
Well, I was going to say that who of us in this room haven't had occasions in their lives, and mine's a long life so far, let's hope it's longer, periods of anxiety, depression, grief and trauma as part of our normal experience and condition. we've been talking about stigma a minute ago. So it's often said, and we like to say, and it may be in Joe's terms as the fella's saying it, if you get through those things, and all of us have had them, you can say to yourself, well, that's helped me grow. So don't we need to be careful about that stigmatisation and intervening when, after all, it could be said that some of these matters are part of the normal function human experience. Now, I know it gets too far, you've got to intervene, but I think we need to approach that delicate question of when do you intervene?
Thank you, Ron. I think it's a really great question. It's a really important issue. Is how much of our emotional well-being and good mental health, or lack of, is part of the ebb and flow of life? And are we a little bit too quick to pathologise it and give it a pill? This is something that concerns me greatly. Helen, I'm going to throw this over to you because I know you've often quoted the 1 in 5 Australians in any one year will experience mental illness. Every time that comes up in the news, which it does regularly, I find I bristle because I don't feel comfortable with that figure. I don't really believe it.
You don't believe it's that high or that low?
Well, actually, I don't, and I'm being provocative now, but I don't believe it's that high because I think what we're talking about is more just the normal ebb and flow of miseries, depressions, even as the Dalai Lama said to me once, that sometimes he really gets the miseries, gets terrible miseries, he said, and I get the angries. But the normal ebb and flow of life, not an illness as such that needs to be labelled and treated.
Yeah, well, look, Ron, I would agree with you 100% on that. Last Saturday, I went to dinner, a large dinner party with some friends of mine who were celebrating their 30th wedding anniversary. And that morning, their 23-year-old daughter, who's like a niece to me, I've known her since she was a baby, had been called by her best friend's to-be fiancé in Thailand, where they were on holiday. He'd taken a ring and was going to propose to her lovely girl. And she'd been killed in a motorbike accident. And I'll call her my niece rather than name her, was in a completely distraught state, as you might imagine. So is her family, so we all. And I spent a fair bit of time with her during the evening because as part of helping her parents manage the dinner, the large dinner that they were hosting. And she said to me at one point that she felt so terrible about taking her parents' attention on this evening and so worried that she wouldn't be able to function well at work on Monday. And I said to her, if you were a young woman 150 years ago, you'd be wearing black and you'd go into a period of mourning because grieving and mourning would be accepted as a normal part of life. It would be expected that you wouldn't be able to function and that you would take whatever time you needed to recover. We don't do that. We don't honour misery, we don't honour suffering, we don't mourn, we don't grieve. We're supposed to be getting on with being excellent, outstanding, highly successful individuals. And Virginia, I agree with you. I think to say that 20% of the population every year has a mental health disorder is demonstrably the case statistically. In fact, that's probably an underestimate because people with mental disorders tend not to participate in surveys. An additional 2 in 5, bringing it to 3 in 5 in total, have what we call subclinical levels of disorder. And over a lifetime, more than half of us will have a significant mental disorder of some kind, and we will certainly know someone close to us who does. But these statistics are meaningless unless you understand them in our societal context. And our societal context is that you must be a success, you must be on your game every match. You must achieve wealth and preferably fame if you can. You must be thin and good looking. You must be a million different things that almost all of us can't be any of the time, let alone all the time. And I think the reason that mental disorders are so enormously more prevalent among young people than they are among people as we get older is because they feel that pressure so much more intensely. They don't have the life experience to know it's all rubbish. and they don't have the strength and the voice to be able to say no. So yes, saying 1 in 5 of us has a mental disorder every year is definitely true statistically. It's also misrepresenting what good mental health is or ought to be and how we ought to respond to it. It's not something to treat, it's something to live with as part of the human condition.
Those aspects of living with it and the story that you just told about your niece is heartbreaking. But the response that you gave her is a really good one, I think, that once upon a time she would have been allowed to openly grieve like that. I mean, are we getting to a point where we should encourage our families and our colleagues to not only put their hand up and say, look, I'm having a bad time, but for example, if you're having a really miserable time and you don't feel you can face people, you can ring up your work or your boss and say, I'm not coming in today because I just feel depressed, I need to stay away. I mean, is that what we're getting to? And is that acceptable?
Well, people do have their doona days, we know from work, and it's...
What's a doona day?
A doona day is one of those days where you refuse to get up and come to work because you just
don't
feel like it. No, I don't have them either, but I'm sure I'd like to. So,
but I mean, isn't that a good thing? I would encourage people to do that.
It's a great thing. And we shouldn't... we disembody our minds from our bodies, and we privilege enormously our minds and our capacities for our minds to function. And we think if they're emotional but not logical, they're not functioning. But this isn't true. The emotional part of the brain is the more ancient and more important part of the brain. It's the part of the brain that gives us our good judgment. It's the part of the brain that tells us when to run or when to fight. It's the part of the brain that holds our most important memories. It's the part of the brain that defines who we are, who we know ourselves to be, and what we truly believe that we should be. And yet this doesn't count because it's not logical somehow. I think that's a reason why women's opinions count less as well, because they're seen to be more emotional and less logical and cold and rational. Give me a good emotional outburst anytime, I say.
Couldn't agree more, couldn't agree more. I want to take a question from Robin Pender, who has sent in a question specifically about the workplace. We actually got quite a few on the workplace, and one that I'll read out if we've got time, which is quite, it's anonymous and quite heartbreaking. Is Robin with us? She is, right at the front. Do you have a microphone there? No. Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to ask, what do you see as the role of the workplace as a key part of the community in looking after the emotional health of its community?
Thank you, Robin. I think that's a very important issue, is what is the workplace's role? And look, I'll just add to this because I did find it very, very sad to read. One of the anonymous questions that came in was about disempowerment in the workplace. And the person says, what can you do if you happen to have a boss or bosses who are vindictive, lying, rough and heavy-handed in behaviour, snapping and shouting and colluding behind your back against you? The outcome is extremely traumatic and psychologically damaging. They remain in power and you suffer under them with very little future prospect. Now, I can read into that someone who's really struggling with a sense of being disempowered at work and possibly not valued, which is horrible, absolutely horrible. But what is the role of the workplace? I mean, how much does the workplace, or should we hold the workplace accountable for people's emotional well-being? Francis, I might throw that over to you to start with.
Yep, thanks. I think this is a hard question because, I mean, I'm a CEO and there have been many occasions, I think, where I might have done the wrong thing here. But the role of the workplace, in classic speak, is for people to come to do a job. Many people come to do a job, and when they get there, they also find a great social network. And they often find maybe some type of emotional supports that they don't find elsewhere. And then they may also encounter a situation that begins to undermine their sense of self. They may feel bullied. They may feel discriminated against. They may feel they're always on the fag end of a decision. And some people say you don't go to the workplace to do therapy, you go to the workplace to do work. But it's become a really blurred place because for many people this is their community. They live on their own. It often becomes a place they stay at longer than other people do. It's very difficult to answer this because trying to do a fair thing by everybody is awkward in the first place. Trying to be honest about the situations people are in is terribly hard to manage, particularly if it's a subordinate versus a person who's in charge. Because there's this underwritten rule that people are meant to support down the line as well. But when people start to feel destroyed in a place, you need to have a bit of courage in management to realise that you've got a sick organisation when that's happening. And to be able to step aside from your role and allow somebody else to take authority. That usually means bringing someone in from the outside and also doing it such that you're not trying to get rid of the problem that's making the noise, but you're prepared to take on the objective advice. And I don't think that's very common, that process.
I'm fascinated to hear your response to that. I'm wondering, why shouldn't it be part of an organisation's mission statement that taking care of their workers' emotional health is part of their mission? Now, I know, as you say, and it's difficult being a CEO, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to pick on you, but yes, we don't go to work for therapy, and we don't go to work to necessarily, create a social group or make friends. But the reality is, I certainly do, spend more time at work with my workmates than I do with my husband or at home. 1 in 4 Australians now live in single households. So our workplace is increasingly important for our sense of being, our sense of identity, our sense of self. So isn't it beholden, therefore, upon organisations to start understanding that the emotional health of workers is part of its obligation?
Yeah, I think that is true, and I think there's been a big change in human resource management, they call it, around that. And of course, a healthy workforce is supposedly more productive, but I don't want to buy into that paradigm too much because I've also critiqued it. There's no question that a mission of any organisation that bases itself on trying to recognise in the first place and deal with people with dignity gets somewhere. I just think when the rubber hits the road about how do you deal with those situations, if you have the courage to deal with, this is the trouble with our HR rules, if you have the courage to deal with people in an individual situation as opposed to the manual, it helps. But if you have to go by the manual, then it all gets legal and it just gets terrible. And I'm saying that from both ends of this. And a much more pastoral approach would be wonderful. And I don't know how that is going to be resolved. I really don't have answers to it.
We could talk about this all night, but one thing I'd like to say is, shouldn't we be choosing leaders and leaders of organisations and CEOs more and more according to their ability to be pastoral and act intuitively rather than by the manual book?
Should I answer that to finish? So I don't get any more questions?
I haven't finished with you yet.
I've heard that before. Of course, what are we asking people to do in the workplace or even to lead workplaces goes back to my original thing. Individuals are more than people doing things, they are persons. The workplace is a community to build like anywhere else.
The community should be a place of nurture, not destruction, like anywhere else. We don't employ people in senior roles with that job description. We employ people in senior roles that will make sure the profit margin is delivered and that they're out of the courts on HR problems. That's it. Doesn't matter whether you're running a church organisation, a faith-based organisation, a for-profit one. Everyone will tell you it's a great mission statement, but when they start going broke, they don't look for a person to lead a mission organisation. They look for someone to keep them in the black. That's the problem. And the leader that we want, well, I would like, is someone who says that human flourishing is the main goal here.
Yeah. Beautifully put, thank you. You did. We're running out of time, but I'm going to take one last question from Dr. Ian Parker. Rian, if you are with us, hand up. So if someone can take the mic down to Rian at the back there. I just wonder, we are going to have to wind up shortly, but I want to get onto the issue of services. A lot of questions came in about particular services, but the theme being gaps in services when it comes to support or the provision of support for people with mental illness in particular. Rian, if you've got the mic now, your question.
So this is a question you get from a health services researcher. Despite more government investment in mental health services, we still have significant gaps in service provision. Why, in a wealthy society like ours, are we still falling short in supporting people with mental illness?
Thank you, Rian, and I think it's a very important one. I'm glad we've got a chance to touch on that. David, you might want to kick us off on that one.
I get the easy one. Okay. Look, it's. I think it's about the fact that our systems are built around a crisis response, and that's one aspect. So that really it takes someone to, metaphorically fall off the cliff before they fall into even brand new, nice big mental health wards or prisons. And I think that's a false investment, both economically and socially. And I think, we need to really be smarter about having early support, early prevention approaches that help people at the top of the cliff where they're already probably crying out to get access to with helps in various ways, especially, and that's why it links also to the issue that Ron raised about medicalising and pathologising mental illness and mental health problems, is that a lot of the supports that prevent people falling off the cliff are psychosocial ones, ones around helping people maintain their job, or the support in the community around accommodation supports or relationship issues that need supports. And I think if we, or around bullying episodes in the workplace or in the community, and I think all those issues, if they were addressed directly, you would prevent a lot of these crisis situations from happening. But if we're mainly having a crisis system and building them bigger, they're going to just fill up as quickly as ever, and those psychosocial supports for people's ability to function independently and live in their homes and be valued in the community, wanting to contribute. I think most people want to contribute to the community, want to be independent, want all the normal things that everyone else wants. So if we focus our resources and attention there, we'll actually be investing in people, which is what Francis' critique was indicating too, rather than in people being instrumentalised in the workplace and being used as means to narrow economic ends. So we really need to redesign our workplaces too, to see that to get the best out of people, you build on their strengths and work as a team that works complementary to each other and supports people in their vulnerabilities. And that's in every dimension of our community and society. If we took that attitude, we'd be a lot better off in so many ways.
Thank you. That's a wonderful way of putting it. And takes a sort of full circle back to what we started off talking about, that Lisa raised the issue of the OECD, and I think Francis you did too, as of growth and our society's health being valued on its economic growth and what have you. As you just say, David, if we look after people more and support them in their vulnerabilities and what have you, you get more out of people. So we still do come back with more, but it's just in a more holistic way. Before I get everyone's summary, big idea and prescription, Helen, I just want to come back to you. You've spoken about the mental illness as being contagious. And I'm a bit curious about that. I must say, when I first heard that, I was not quite sure what you meant. But can you just elaborate a little bit on that?
Yes, I was thinking about the medical model that we use for health, and rather than the holistic societal model that we're talking about, and I think most of us are advocating this evening. And in the medical model, we divide things into infectious diseases and non-communicable diseases, if you like. And infectious diseases are things like viruses and bacterial diseases and so on. And non-communicable diseases are not those. They're defined as not infectious diseases. So, of course, mental health disorders are not infectious diseases in that sense. But we misunderstand them profoundly if we take them in that medical setting and out of their societal setting. So if we see them as just disorders, no, they're not infectious. But on the other hand, if you have a parent or a partner or a boss or a workmate or a friend with a mental disorder, your risk of having a mental disorder yourself is enormously elevated. So they are contagious in that sense, even though they're not viral or bacterial. And if we see things in this narrow medical model, then that's how they are. If we see things as part of the normal human condition and of life and of being social animals and part of society, then we can understand that really differently, that those who are closest to us and those who have the greatest influence on us do affect our lives profoundly, and we affect theirs. So it's in that sense I talk about contagion.
So that then leans towards even more the need for our communities, whether they're our working communities or our social communities, to be supportive and encourage the good emotional health of everyone for the sake of the group.
Absolutely. At the same time, I think we need to be really careful about where stigma comes from, the way we understand mental disorders. The mental conditions are heavily stigmatised. Mental disorders are not real illnesses, they're malingering in some way. And people are afraid of them. I think we need to be aware that the very large majority of mental disorders are not something to fear. They're something that can be hard to understand and deal with, but they're not something to fear. But there are a few mental disorders that are genuinely fear-provoking for good reason. Some psychoses, for example, are associated with outbursts of physical and verbal violence. That is something to fear. We talked about bullying in the workplace just a moment ago. Bullying, real bullying, I don't mean tough-nosed, business-headed leadership, which is focused on the bottom line. I mean real bullying is strongly associated with narcissistic personality disorder. And for those of you who've encountered any narcissists, you will know that's something to be absolutely terrified of and run as fast as you can in the other direction. So we do need to understand that some mental disorders really are problematic for the good functioning of society. That doesn't mean we should take a punitive approach or a blaming approach or an approach that is not focused on well-being and assisting and supporting people. But it does mean that we need to really understand what mental disorders are all about and how they're different from the normal ebb and flow and the ups and downs of life.
Thank you for that, Helen, and thank you for clarifying. That was fantastic. I'm going to ask each of our panel members now to give us their one big idea, to finish with one big idea, their prescription to produce better mental health and emotional well-being outcomes or outcome. Your one big idea, Francis, we'll start with you.
You said you wouldn't pick on me anymore. Well, going back to what I said at the beginning, that in some sense our society is so work-driven, so task-oriented, that it brings in a huge sense of disease. I think the government could introduce a tax credit or some sort of negative tax arrangement whereby if you chose to work 20% less of the time, by the tax change you wouldn't lose any money. This would mean that more people could get work, we would be working for less hours and putting ourselves under less duress. We wouldn't be putting those dependent upon us and their welfare at risk.
Fantastic idea, I love it. I hope we have members of the government here, do we? That is a really brilliant idea. Lovely, thank you. David.
Wow, it's tough to settle on one big idea. It's not as if there's one thing that is a panacea, which is often what we look for in our society as well, or the magic pill, magic bullet. But I think, regardless of that, I think talking about the importance of the workplace and opportunities for people who are marginalised or disadvantaged by their experience of mental distress or mental illness, I think supporting, especially in this year of, is it the UN International Year of Cooperatives and Social Enterprises, I think creating new forms of workplaces that actually support people for social ends, you know, that in a whole network of these social enterprises that would tap into people's skills, support them in their vulnerabilities, still be part of the market economy, but redefine what it means to be, you know, in work and building on your strengths and contributing to society as well. And it would also then allow people to use their lived experience as the very means to contribute and draw on in terms of, you know, also having roles as peer workers to reform the mental health system and the medical system and the community service systems in terms of how to best respond to people with these problems. If they were paid and valued in these sorts of work frameworks, I think we'd have a different society than we've got today.
I love that. Thank you, David. It's a beautiful idea of encouraging environments, working environments where people are encouraged to use their lived experience. I think it's a fantastic idea, and it all does come back to valuing that too. Helen.
Thank you. Only a very small proportion of mental disorders are organic, begin in some individual's brain, and that's really bad luck. The vast majority of mental health problems are derived from social circumstances and societal processes. And I think these boil down to the misuse of power in society. And as our societies, particularly our westernised style wealthy societies, become more and more unequal, I think this misuse of power becomes more and more unequal. People don't have equal power, they don't have equal voice. And those who most need to speak and most need to be heard can't. I think the thing that we need to concentrate on more than anything else is to fight against any form of injustice, disenfranchisement, and the subordination of the vulnerable in society.
Fantastic. Thank you, Helen. Last but not least, Joe.
I think everyone's taken a very societal view, and what I've found, I think, a little bit difficult this evening is to extract myself from being a representative of a section of the community, of being a male or of being a sportsman, and I think that's so I'm going to leave you with, rather than the societal level, something relating to those areas. And I'm going to plagiarise a message, basically. It's the antithesis of all that I was led to believe as a professional athlete and a man in the embedded culture that I lived in for 10 years. But there's a young guy in Brisbane who's doing wonderful things, breaking down the barriers with men and promoting emotional, mental health and well-being. And he's running a very successful campaign, and I'll just leave you with the tagline of that campaign, which I think many of us, particularly men, could take on board, and that campaign's called "Soften the F*** Up." And it's a very successful campaign, and I think it says a lot about the male psyche, but also about what we need to do, particularly as men within society.
I'm glad you said that. I wouldn't be allowed to say that.
I know, my Vice-Chancellor's in the back of the room as well.
It's perfect. It's a perfect, well, it's a slogan, I guess, but a perfect slogan because it goes right to the heart of that male blokey thing. Fantastic. Thank you very much, Joe. I've got one, a very simple one, a prescription to encourage greater or better emotional health and mental well-being, and that is turn off the television. Turn off mainstream media, forget the drivel, turn away from it, encourage others to turn away from it and kick back against the dumbing down of our society and public discourse. There you go, I've said it. Just lost my job. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank the University of Canberra, Vice-Chancellor Stephen Parker, and very much Inga Davis also, who has been instrumental in getting tonight together, and to all of you for coming along. There is no one answer to the big question that we posed tonight, but as I said at the beginning, our aim was to get you to go away and start a conversation. And if we do that, well, we've done something here. So thank you to you for coming along tonight. A very big thank you to Professor Helen Berry, Joe Roth, David Lovegrove, and Professor Lisa Jackson, who left us, and Francis Sullivan. Thank you very much.